This thing on the left here is a piece of research that is done every 6 months by a group of very wonderful people at the Yale Center for Climate Change Communications and George Mason's Center for Climate Change Communications. Two guys named Tony Lazarowitz and Ed Maibach. I have met them both. They are wonderful people, and they do really great work. And this survey, Climate Change in the American Mind, is available on the Yale website. They do it roughly every 6 months, and it's a benchmark study where they ask the same questions every 6 months and track the results. And through this study, we have gotten a really good understanding of where people's heads are at with respect to climate change in this country. So this is a piece of research I use pretty faithfully in my work, and so I consider it pretty authoritative, and it's readily available for free. So you should be looking for it too. I do not, but it's readily downloadable. But we're going to talk a little bit about what it says, and I'll have some slides. It's through the Yale Climate Change Communication Program and through George Mason. Yes, ma'am. Yes. So here's what we know about people's attitudes on climate change. 7 in 10 Americans believe that global warming is happening. More than 5 in 10, more than 50% believe it is man-made. 6 in 10 are at least somewhat, if not very, concerned about climate change. And yet, more than 6 in 10 rarely, if ever, discuss global warming with their friends and family. And less than 1 in 4 Americans hear people they know talk about global warming more than once a month. This is what Ed Maibach calls the great climate silence. And it is one of the reasons, I believe, why getting traction on climate action is so difficult. Because you cannot fix a problem that you will not talk about. So why are we so quiet? Why don't we talk? And I'm going to give you some of the answers as we know from the research. First, we think, I don't know enough. Most people really hate looking stupid. And climate science seems really big and really complicated. There's all kinds of studies, 2 degrees centigrade. What does that mean? What is one difference between 1.5 and 2? What is, how do we, all these graphs and charts, what do they mean? All those facts that I showed you were overwhelming in part because they're so detailed and you kind of need to know really understand what they say to really know what they mean. And that's really beyond the ken of most people when they're having a conversation with their buddy in a bar. And I like to tell people, look, if you went out in the street and stopped 10 people and asked them to tell you how climate change works, 9 of them would right off the bat tell you, I don't know. The 10th would get about 3 sentences in, realize that they knew less than they thought they did, and be like, I'm sorry, I don't know. And when people don't have confidence that they know enough, they're unwilling to start the conversation. And I noticed that when we started our conversation, and I asked you what you knew, all of you responded with things that you knew personally, because that's what we are most confident about. And that is a valid place to start. A lot of people think that they cannot have a conversation about climate change without talking about the science, and you can. In fact, that's how we started. And it is perfectly valid to talk about your personal experience with climate change and what you personally believe is happening. That is a valid topic of discussion. And people shouldn't feel invalidated because I'm not a scientist. Who cares? Climate change is impacting you too. Next, people say, it doesn't matter if I talk about climate change. That's not going to help anything. And actually, there are people out there who believe that there's nothing that's going to help. There are people who have gotten overwhelmed by the notion of what climate change is and could do to the planet, and they've decided to check out. A lot of times when something is overwhelming, we freeze. And we don't want to deal with it. There is research, and I'll show you this in a second. Some people don't believe global warming will happen to them. This is why the polar bear is a craptastic ambassador for climate change. Because most people in their lives are never going to go to the Arctic and see a polar bear where they live. in person. And so climate change is something that happens to animals and creatures that are very far away from them. And so it doesn't hit home. It's not personal. Some people think there is no solution. That's why I spent the last bit talking about the solutions. We have the solutions. We merely lack the will to implement them. And one of the things we found in research that we've done at the Nature Conservancy, investigating how right-leaning audiences talk about climate change and where they find the most connectivity. The most connectivity is when you talk about solutions, not when you talk about the problem. People feel empowered when you talk about solutions. My dad is a big old climate denier, which is very ironic. You can imagine what the conversation was when I told my dad I was taking a job at the Nature Conservancy to work on climate change. And so I cannot have a conversation with my dad where I talk about, 2 degrees centigrade or any of that stuff. He'll tell me NASA's hiding all the facts and recite the latest talking points from the Heartland Institute. And that doesn't go very well. But I can have a conversation with my dad about the need to transition to low carbon and renewable energy sources. And so that is a way to start having conversations with people that are effectively about climate change, that maybe aren't about climate change. Also, some people don't find it personally important. They are fewer than you might think, but they're not an insignificant number. There are some people who just don't care. They are trying to feed their family. They are trying to get their kid to school on time. They are trying to pay the rent. And for them, worrying about something that's going to happen 50 years in the future doesn't make much sense. And that's borne out by the research. So this is part of the climate anemia. All of these graphs that I'm going to show you are from the Yale and George Mason research. So many Americans think they will be harmed by global warming, but they think others will be harmed more. For instance, when you ask them, how much do you think global warming will harm plant and animal species? A great deal and a moderate amount. 71% believe that plant and animal species will be harmed at least a moderate amount. Future generations, 69%. The world's poor, 64%. People in developing countries, 64%. People in the US, 59%. People in your community now are below 50%. So most Americans believe that climate change is going to happen to other people, but not to them. Only 44% think that it's going to affect them. And so this is a big barrier that we have to having conversations, is helping people understand, it's coming for you. In fact, it's coming right now. But when people don't believe it's going to affect them, it's hard to get them interested in the conversation. The issue of global warming is personally important to more than 6 in 10 Americans, but what that means is it's also not important to 36% of Americans. That's a lot. That's more than a third. More than a third of Americans don't believe that global warming is personally important to them. They don't care. They're watching the Kardashians. The Real Housewives is on tonight. I gotta get food on the table tonight. My kid's autistic. I don't have time to worry about this. 4 in 10 Americans think the actions of a single individual won't make any difference. So that's not a majority, but it's still a significant amount. And when you feel like there's nothing you personally can do about something, your natural instinct is to check out. I can't do anything about that, so I'm just going to not worry about it. So that's the I don't think I can do anything problem. And here's the last and the one that we probably think have naturally comes to mind when we think of this. I don't want to cause unpleasantness. We are social beings. We like to get along with our friends and family. We don't like to start fights. We don't like to feel like we're in conflict with people that we love and that people that we're close to. So if we sense that a topic of conversation is going to be touchy, we don't bring it up. If it's going to be scary, we don't bring it up. And climate change looks real scary. It's overwhelming. When you start to get into what could actually happen, that's scary. And it's overwhelming. And why would you do that to your friends? Why would you do that to people you love? The other thing is people, for obviously reasons, think that climate change is political. We ran a focus group in New Hampshire with right-leaning audiences, and the moderator of the focus group, who is a very well-respected Republican pollster, she was talking to the group, and she got about a third of the way into the discussion, and she said the words climate change for the first time. And immediately some guy in the back was like, well, why'd you have to go and make this political? One of the reasons why people started using terms like global warming is because climate change was just, for many people on the right-hand side of the aisle, a conversation stopper. That was an immediate, I'm tuned out, I know who you are, I'm not interested in listening to you anymore. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about what they call second-order beliefs. Because what you think the people around you believe is often different from and becomes more important to you than what they actually believe. We know this through doing a lot of studies with juries. So juries will go into a jury room with all the evidence presented, and if they don't immediately all vote to convict, usually it's because one person has spoken up and said, I'm not sure. And if that one person speaks up, other people who have had doubts will be like, oh, wait a minute, I kind of not sure about this too. But if you think you're the only one and you stay quiet and nobody speaks out, they'll vote to convict. So if there's not that one person who's willing to say, this is what I think, and maybe it's different from what you think, but I'm going to say it anyway, it's not going to happen. So what we think other people think around us becomes more important. Remember, 7 in 10 people believe global warming is happening. Does that surprise you? Yes, ma'am. Yes, it has. We do have some. It is in the MyBot research, and it's gone kind of up and down. It's hovered around. It's gone. It's ticked up a little bit. It's always been a little more than half. There were points when so 7 in 10 is pretty high, and it's actually starting to edge up closer to 80. You were going to say something? Okay. So your neighbors may actually think differently than you think they do. So I'm gonna out myself here a little bit. I'm a Democrat, and about 10 years ago, I was working for Fairfax County Democrats, and Fairfax County at the time was going from red to blue. And people still thought of Fairfax County as a fairly red place, but really it was transitioning to blue. And you would get a walk sheet with 10 houses that you would go to visit and canvass during election time. And 6 of those 10, because of the information that you had, you knew were reliable Democrats. 6 in 10 voted in all the Democratic primaries, and you knew they were given to the party, et cetera, et cetera. So you had 6 in 10 reliable Democrats on that block of 10 houses. And you would go to each of those houses, and every one of them would tell me the same 2 things. 1, I am the only Democrat on this block. No, you're not. 2, I do not want a yard sign because I might make my neighbors angry. And that's the way it is a lot with climate. 7 in 10 is a significant majority of people. But I guarantee you've probably sat in a room with people and thought, nobody else here thinks the way I do. And you're probably statistically wrong. Yes, sir. Exactly. Yep. There is one, and what it takes is one person, and then all of a sudden every other person who's been secretly thinking that and scared can say something. Fewer than half of Americans perceive social norms for taking action on global warming. How important is it to your friends and family that you take action to reduce global warming? Less than half, moderate, extreme, very. More than half, don't know, not important, not very. So most people don't believe it's important to their families and friends to do something about global warming. Even though 7 in 10 people think global warming is happening, and 6 in 10, more than half, are actually concerned about it. Oh. That's a second order belief in action right there. How much of an effort do your family and friends make to reduce global warming? Again, majority of Americans don't make an effort of any kind, or they don't know. All right, so we're going to wrap this section up a little bit. A lot of the purpose of me going through all these excuses is to help us, as people who would talk about climate change with the people around us, take a look at how we're thinking about things and realize that some of the reasons we tell ourselves for why we don't open up that bridge and talk to people, we need to dismantle. And encouraging other people to talk about climate change, figuring out why aren't they talking about climate change? Maybe it's because they think they've already done enough, or maybe it's because they think that maybe they're harboring a notion that because it's going to happen to someone else, or because they're already caring for the poor, that they don't need to engage on this particular topic. The other study that Ed Maibach does is a study called the 6 Americas. And I highly recommend looking at the 6 Americas study. It basically divides people up into sort of 6 personality types with respect to climate change. Everything from hardcore deniers to people who are incredibly alarmed and upset. And everybody, and he sort of susses out how much of America is in each of these 6 Americas. And the number of hardcore deniers is actually quite small. I believe it's under 10%. I'm going to have to look it up. You have leaning towards that end of the spectrum, you have people who are more skeptical, and people who are disengaged, and people who don't want to engage. And so you have to understand what you're dealing with, because it might not be like, my dad's a hardcore denier. Like, he literally has an arsenal of Heartland Institute research that if you try to talk to him about climate change, he'll demand you tell him why NASA is hiding all the data, et cetera, et cetera. There's no convincing him. But most of the folks that I know who aren't climate activists, it's more, I don't understand it. I don't know all the science. And so how can I make a decision? And it sounds like it's really scary, and I'm just not sure. And because I don't trust the people who are saying climate change is happening, I'm not going to trust that it is. And that's a different problem than I am supremely convinced by data that I have collected myself from fake news sources. Which is a different problem from the person who doesn't know anything at all and just doesn't have time to find out because they're too busy with something else. Their life is too full and they don't have the bandwidth. So these are some of the things that I think we can take away from this as reasons to start a conversation and reasons to dismantle that disempowerment that happens. Is you can talk about solutions. You can talk about your experiences. They are a legitimate basis for starting a conversation. So, the fact that you can't fix everything is not a reason to do nothing. The fact that I cannot personally make everybody convert to solar power doesn't mean that I shouldn't advocate for it. It doesn't have to be divisive, as we've just been talking about. And people may just be relieved to know they're not alone. The mere act of saying, hey, I'm kind of concerned about this, aren't you? Might be a relief to somebody who thought that they were the only person in the room who felt that way. All right, so thankfully, are we on time? Awesome, I love it. All right, so we have time for a break again.